The air at the Miller Estate auction hung thick and heavy with the ghosts of 70 years of farming. It was a smell unique to such places, a cocktail of dust, sun-baked grease, and the faint, sweet scent of decaying alfalfa from the hayloft of the big red barn. It was late summer, 1974, and the heat shimmered off the hoods of the pickup trucks parked haphazardly in the pasture. Men in seed corn caps stood in tight knots, their voices a low murmur against the rhythmic chant of the auctioneer. Jedediah Stone stood apart from the crowds, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn denim overalls. He wasn't here for the main event, the line of well-kept but dated John Deere 2-cylinders that old man Miller had cherished. He was here for the scrap row, the iron boneyard where forgotten implements went to die. His eyes, the color of a faded prairie sky, scanned the collection of rusted discs, bent plows and planters with seized-up seed boxes. A man could find a lot of good steel back there if he knew what to look for. A slick voice cut through the low din. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Jed Stone, gracing us with your presence. Don't tell me you're thinking of upgrading from that museum collection you call a machinery lineup." Jed turned slowly. Lyle Peterson stood there, a wide, predatory smile on his face. Lyle was the owner of Peterson Implement, the biggest John Deere dealership in 3 counties. He wore a crisp green polo shirt with the leaping deer logo over the pocket, clean khaki pants, and polished boots that had never seen a lick of mud. He smelled of cologne and easy credit. "Lyle," Jed said, his voice a low rumble, "just looking." "Looking." "Jed, the good stuff is up front," Lyle said, gesturing with a manicured hand toward the auction block where a shiny new John Deere 4630 on consignment was drawing oohs and ahs. "Variable rate financing, low introductory APR. We could have you in that cab by tomorrow. Think of it, air conditioning, a radio. You wouldn't have to listen to that old Cummins screaming in your ear all day." Lyle was referring to Jed's tractor, a first-generation versatile 145. It was an ugly brute of a machine, an articulated 4-wheel drive with a faded sun-blistered coat of what was once red and yellow paint. Jed had bought it for a song 5 years back from a farmer up north whose son had convinced him to trade it for a new Steiger. The paint was shot and the cab was little more than a metal box to keep the worst of the weather off, but its heart was a 504 cubic inch Cummins V8 diesel that Jed had rebuilt himself, bolt by bolt. It was loud, it was crude, but it pulled like a freight train and it was paid for. That last part was the most important. "She runs good, Lyle. Doesn't owe me a dime," Jed replied, his gaze drifting back to the scrap pile. Lyle chuckled, a sound that grated on Jed's nerves. "Runs good? Jed, that thing is a relic. It's obsolete. Technology has moved on. You're out there wrestling with that old beast, choking on dust, while my customers are sitting in a sound guard body, cool as a cucumber, farming twice the acres in half the time. You're falling behind." A few other farmers had drifted closer, drawn by the confrontation. They looked from Lyle's confident smirk to Jed's stoic, grease-stained hands. Most of them were Lyle's customers. They had the new tractors, the big combines, the heavy lines of credit at the bank that Lyle had so graciously helped them secure. They saw Jed as a stubborn old fool, a relic himself, clinging to the ways of his father. Jed's father, a man forged in the crucible of the Great Depression, had taught him 2 things: how to turn a wrench and how to hate debt. "The bankers and the machinery men," his father used to say, "they'll sell you a golden dream on paper, and when the rain stops falling, they'll own your land. Pay cash or don't buy it at all." Jed had lived by that code his entire life. His farm was modest, 480 acres of good black Iowa dirt, every square inch of it his own. The auctioneer's patter moved down the line to the scrap row. Jed's eyes locked on an old International Harvester 10-shank V-ripper. It was beat to hell. 2 of the shanks were bent, the paint was long gone, and the hydraulic cylinder wept a slow trail of fluid into the dust. But the frame, the main spine of the thing, was solid. He could see it. He could feel the integrity of the steel just by looking at it. "Lot 142, gentlemen. What do we bid for this fine piece of yard art?" the auctioneer called out, getting a laugh from the crowd. "Who'll give me $50? $50 bill, now 20 to start it. Who'll give 20? Jed raised a single finger. Got 20 from Mr. Stone, now 30, who'll give 30? Silence. The other farmers looked at the twisted piece of metal and saw only scrap iron. Lyle Peterson scoffed loud enough for everyone to hear. Sold for $20, to the man with the strong back and the weak mind, the auctioneer cried, pointing his gavel at Jed. Jed ignored the snickers from the crowd. He walked over to Lyle, pulling a worn leather wallet from his overalls. He peeled off a crisp $20 bill and held it out. Don't you want to put that on your parts account, Jed? Lyle sneered. Or is your credit no good even for $20? I pay my way, Jed said simply, pressing the bill into Lyle's hand. Lyle looked at the bill as if it were contaminated. Suit yourself. When you get tired of playing blacksmith with that piece of junk, my offer still stands. I'll give you a fair trade-in on that old Versatile and the rest of your iron antiques. We'll get you into a new 8630, four-wheel drive, 225 horses at the drawbar. You could pull two of those rippers and not even know they're back there. Jed just shook his head. Thanks, Lyle, but I'm not looking to get married to the bank. He turned and walked away, the sound of Lyle's condescending laughter following him across the dusty pasture. He knew what they were all thinking. He was a fool. A man stuck in the past while the world and the price of corn was racing toward a glorious future. But as he looked at the bent and broken V-Ripper, he didn't see junk. He saw potential. He saw good, honest steel that just needed a little heat, a strong arm, and a patient hand to be made useful again. He saw value where others saw only rust. Before we go any further, down into the grease and the grit of what it took for a man like Jed to stand his ground, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever owned a piece of machinery, a tractor, a truck, even just a simple tool, that everyone else called junk, but you knew its true worth? A machine you kept running with your own two hands against all odds. Let me know in the comments below what it was, and tell me the story of why you believed in it when no one else did. The V-Ripper was a bear to get home. Jed had to use a chain hoist and a series of heavy timbers to skid it onto his flatbed trailer. He hauled it back to his farmstead, the modest collection of buildings dwarfed by the massive cathedral-like barns and shiny machine sheds of his neighbors who farmed with Lyle Peterson's green iron. Jed's own machine shed was an older pole-style building, but the concrete floor inside was swept clean and every tool hung in its proper place on the pegboard walls. This was his sanctuary, a place of work and restoration. For the next week, every hour he wasn't in the field was spent on the Ripper. He fired up his acetylene torch, the hiss and pop of the flame a familiar song. He heated the two bent shanks until they glowed a cherry red, the heat radiating in waves that made the air in the shop shimmer. Then came the hard part. Using a 20-pound sledgehammer and a series of strategically placed blocks, he began the painstaking process of straightening the thick steel. It was brutal, jarring work. The sledge rang like a church bell with every impact, the shock traveling up the handle and into his shoulders. Sweat poured off him, soaking his shirt and stinging his eyes. Lyle Peterson would have a team of mechanics in a clean shop use a hydraulic press for a job like this. Jed had only fire and muscle. By the third day, the shanks were true. He let them cool slowly, buried in a bucket of sand to keep the steel from becoming brittle. Next, he turned his attention to the hydraulic cylinder. He wrestled it off its pins and laid it on his workbench. The diagnosis was simple. The main piston seal was shot. A trip to the parts store in town confirmed his fears. The cylinder was from an International Harvester model that had been out of production for 15 years. No seals, no rebuild kits, nothing. You're better off just buying a whole new cylinder, Jed, the parts man had said, already reaching for a catalogue of new, universal fit models. A new one would cost him $200. Jed just grunted and walked out. $200 was 10 times what he'd paid for the whole implement. Back in his shop, he carefully disassembled the cylinder. He measured the old, brittle seal with a pair of calipers, writing down the inner diameter, outer diameter, and thickness with the stub of a pencil on a scrap of wood. The next day, he drove 40 miles to a specialty hydraulics shop in the city, a dusty old place run by a German immigrant named Klaus who had forgotten more about hydraulics than most engineers ever knew. Klaus squinted at Jed's scribbled dimensions. "Yeah, this is an old one. double-acting piston seal, U-cup style. He disappeared into the cavernous back room, filled floor to ceiling with thousands of little drawers. Jed could hear him muttering in German as he slid drawers open and shut. 10 minutes later he emerged, a small black neoprene ring held between his thumb and forefinger. "This should do it," he said. "From a forklift. Clark, I think. 1961 model, but dimensions are right." The seal cost Jed $4.50. Back home, he meticulously cleaned every component of the cylinder, honing the inside of the barrel with a fine grit ball hone on his electric drill until it shone like a mirror. He reassembled it with the new seal, coating everything in clean hydraulic fluid. He bolted it back on the ripper, hooked up the hoses to his versatile, and cycled the hydraulics. The cylinder moved smoothly, powerfully, without a single drop of leakage. A slow, satisfied smile spread across Jed's face. As he was standing there, admiring his work, Lyle Peterson's brand-new Lincoln Continental crunched up his gravel driveway. Lyle got out, leaving the engine running and the air conditioning blasting. He sauntered over to the shop, his sunglasses hiding his eyes but not the smug curl of his lips. "Still tinkering with your auction prize, I see," Lyle said, his voice dripping with mock pity. "You know, for what you've probably spent in gas and torch bottles and trips to the city, you could have made a down payment on a new John Deere 2100 minimum till ripper. Would have saved you all this sweat." Jed wiped his greasy hands on a rag. "This one cost me $24.50, Lyle, and a little bit of time." Lyle laughed. "Time is money, Jed. While you've been in here playing mechanic for a week, my customers have been out there making it. Tom Henderson just finished ripping all his corn ground. Said his new 4630 pulled a 7-shank Deere ripper like it wasn't even there. He'll be done with all his fall tillage before you even get that thing in the ground." "Maybe so," Jed said, his eyes fixed on the ripper, "but Tom Henderson's tractor payment is more than my entire property tax bill for the year. And his ripper payment is probably more than I'll spend on fuel this fall." Lyle's smile tightened. He hated it when Jed brought up payments. It was the one argument he couldn't easily refute. His entire business model was built on convincing farmers that debt was not a liability, but an investment, a tool. Jed was a living, breathing contradiction to that gospel. "You can't save your way to prosperity, Jed," Lyle said, his voice turning hard. "This is the 1970s. The world is changing. Russia is buying our grain. Land prices are going to the moon. The guys who are borrowing, the guys who are expanding, they're the ones who are going to own this county in 10 years. You and your penny-pinching ways. You'll be a footnote, a cautionary tale they tell their kids." He turned and walked back to his air-conditioned car, leaving Jed alone in the heat of his shop. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. A cautionary tale. The community gossip echoed Lyle's sentiment. At the grain elevator, at the diner, the talk was the same. "Did you see Jed Stone bought that old piece of junk from the Miller sale? Heard he spent a week straightening the shanks with a sledgehammer. Poor fella. His dad filled his head with all that Depression-era nonsense. He's gonna get left behind." Jed felt the weight of their scorn. It was a lonely thing to be the only man walking when everyone else was running. But as he hitched the rebuilt ripper to the back of his old Versatile, he felt a different kind of conviction settle over him. He fired up the Cummins. The V8 engine roared to life, a deep, throaty bellow that vibrated through the concrete floor of the shop. It wasn't the quiet, refined hum of a new John Deere. It was the sound of raw mechanical power. Honest power. Paid-for power. He backed the tractor out into the sunlight, the ripper tracking perfectly behind him. He would be in the field tomorrow, and he wouldn't owe a single soul for the privilege. The years that followed seemed to prove Lyle Peterson right. The mid-1970s were a golden age for American agriculture. The '72 Russian grain deal had opened the floodgates. Prices for corn and soybeans shot to levels no one had ever dreamed of. Land values doubled, then tripled. The Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, was on the radio telling farmers to get big or get out, and to plant fence-row to fence-row. And the banks, flush with cash, were more than happy to lend them the money to do it. Lyle Peterson's dealership became the epicenter of this new prosperity. He tore down the old, modest showroom and built a massive, gleaming palace of glass and steel. He had a dozen new tractors on the lot at any given time, their green and yellow paint sparkling under the big lights. He hired more salesmen, more mechanics. His commercials were on the local TV station every night. Lyle standing in front of a brand new 8640, telling everyone, "Here at Peterson Implement, we're not just selling tractors, we're selling the future of farming." And the farmers bought it. They lined up to sign the papers. They traded in perfectly good 5- and 10-year-old tractors for new models with a few more horsepower and a fancier cab. They bought bigger planters, bigger combines, bigger grain wagons. They leveraged their rapidly appreciating land to borrow more money to buy more land, often paying exorbitant prices at auction, convinced the boom would never end. Lyle was their prophet, and debt was their new religion. Jed watched it all with a growing sense of unease. He was having good years too. He was getting $3 a bushel for his corn, something his father would have considered a fantasy. But he didn't change a thing. He farmed his 480 acres with the same old equipment. He planted his corn, harvested his beans, and took his checks to the bank. But instead of using the profits as a down payment on a new tractor or another 80 acres, he paid off his annual operating loan in full by July, then put the rest of the money into savings certificates at the local bank. He re-roofed his house and the main barn. He put up a new 20,000 bushel grain bin, paying the contractor in cash. Solid, practical improvements that added real value, not just debt. His neighbors thought he was crazy. Tom Henderson, who farmed the section next to him, stopped by one afternoon. He was driving a brand new John Deere 4840. The thing was a monster. "Jed, what are you doing?" Tom asked, genuinely bewildered. "You could be farming 1,000 acres by now. You're sitting on a gold mine with this land, and you're not using the equity. Lyle would give you a loan to buy out the old Johnson place in a heartbeat." "My equity is for a rainy day, Tom," Jed said calmly, "not for a sunny one." "It's pouring gold, not rain," Tom exclaimed. "You're missing the boat, Jed. You're going to wake up in 5 years and everyone else will be farming 2,000 acres and you'll still be here on your little patch with that old junk." The scorn he'd felt at the auction had morphed into a kind of pity. They didn't see him as a threat or even a fool anymore, just a sad, strange man who didn't understand how the new world worked. He was an anachronism, a living fossil. Lyle Peterson, now the president of the County Commerce Board, would sometimes see Jed in town and just shake his head with a little smile, as if looking at a child who refused to grow up. Lyle himself was living large. He had bought the 320-acre farm on the other side of Jed's place, paying a record $5,000 an acre for it. He didn't farm it himself, of course. He hired a young man to run it for him, outfitting the entire operation with a brand new line of John Deere equipment, all of it financed through his own dealership. He drove his Lincoln, his wife drove a new Cadillac, and they'd built a sprawling new ranch-style house on a hill overlooking the town. He was the king, and his kingdom was built on paper. One crisp autumn evening in 1979, Jed was finishing up his fall dissing. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The old Versatile rumbled along steadily, pulling the heavy offset disc through the corn stubble. The Cummins V8 had settled into a deep, rhythmic growl, a sound as comforting to Jed as his own heartbeat. He had the cab window open, and the cool air felt good on his face. He felt content. His crops were in the bin, he had no debts, and he had a healthy sum in the bank. As he made his last pass along the fence line he shared with the farm Lyle now owned, he saw the flashing lights. An ambulance and the sheriff's car were parked next to Lyle's massive new machine shed. Jed throttled down the Versatile and watched. He saw them carry a man out on a stretcher. It was the young man Lyle had hired. Later, at the co-op, he heard the story. The young man had gotten his arm caught in the auger of a brand new combine. A freak accident, they said, but Jed knew better. The kid was running 2 brand new combines by himself, trying to get all 320 acres of Lyle's beans out before the rain came. He was exhausted, pushed past his limits by the sheer scale and speed of the operation Lyle was running. He was a casualty of the get big or get out philosophy. A few days later, Jed was at the bank, depositing the last of his grain checks. He was standing in line when he heard the bank president, Mr. Abernathy, talking in a hushed but urgent tone on the phone in his office. Jed couldn't hear all of it, just fragments. Words like Paul Volcker, Federal Reserve, unacceptable inflation, and prime rate. When Abernathy hung up, he looked pale. He saw Jed and forced a weak smile. "Afternoon, Jed." "Everything all right, Mr. Abernathy?" Jed asked. Abernathy sighed, running a hand through his thinning grey hair. "They're talking about raising interest rates, Jed. Not by a little bit. By a lot, to fight inflation. I've got half the farmers in this county with operating loans and mortgages tied to the prime rate." He shook his head slowly. "I hope they know what they're doing down there in Washington." Jed finished his business and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. He looked down the street and saw Lyle Peterson's dealership, gleaming like a monument to easy money. He saw the big new tractors on the lot, the sprawling glass showroom, the massive service bays. And for the first time, he didn't see success. He saw a house of cards built on a foundation of floating interest rates, waiting for the first strong wind to blow. A cold chill, colder than the autumn air, crept down his spine. The party was almost over, and a long dark morning was about to dawn. The first sign of trouble arrived not as a thundercloud, but in a quiet announcement on the radio in Jed's workshop. It was January of 1980. President Carter, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, had declared an embargo on grain sales to the USSR. Jed was grinding a new edge on a cultivator sweep when the news came on, and he shut off the grinder to listen. The announcer's voice was grave, but Jed could hear the unspoken panic underneath. The biggest customer American agriculture had ever known was gone, overnight. By spring, the effect was undeniable. The price of corn at the local elevator, which had been flirting with $3.50 a bushel, collapsed. It fell to $2.50, then $2.20. Farmers who had borrowed money against the promise of high prices were suddenly staring into a chasm. The talk at the co-op turned sour. The easy confidence of the 70s was evaporating like a morning mist. Lyle Peterson felt the change first. The stream of farmers looking to trade up to a bigger tractor slowed to a trickle. Then it stopped. Men who had signed purchase orders the previous fall were now calling to cancel, their voices tight with anxiety. Lyle's dealership, once a bustling hub of commerce, grew quiet. The new combines and four-wheel drives sat gleaming under the showroom lights, monuments to a future that had been cancelled. The interest on his floor plan, the money he owed the John Deere Corporation for the inventory on his lot, was a ticking time bomb. Jed saw the strain on Lyle's face one day at the parts counter. Lyle was arguing with a farmer over the price of a set of fuel injectors. His voice, usually so smooth and persuasive, was sharp and brittle. "The price is the price," he snapped. "If you can't afford it, maybe you shouldn't have bought the tractor." The farmer, a young man with fear in his eyes, flinched as if he'd been struck. Lyle's mask of the friendly, helpful dealer was cracking, revealing the desperate creditor beneath. That summer, the weather turned against them. A dome of high pressure settled over the Midwest, and the sky turned a hard, unforgiving blue. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a relentless sun beat down, baking the rich black soil into something resembling concrete. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high by July, was stunted and yellow, its leaves rolling up tight into thin spears, desperately trying to conserve what little moisture they had. The new high-tech equipment began to show its own vulnerabilities. Tom Henderson's massive John Deere 4840, the pride of his fleet, developed a problem. A sensor in the complex hydraulic system failed. The tractor wouldn't lift the planter. Tom called the dealership, and a young mechanic in a clean green uniform came out with a truck full of diagnostic computers. After 3 hours of plugging things in and scratching his head, he gave Tom the bad news. The sensor was part of a sealed controller module. It couldn't be repaired, only replaced. The part was $500, and it would have to be shipped from the regional depot in Moline. It would take a week. Tom stood in his field, watching his planting window slam shut, his $250,000 operation paralyzed by a piece of electronics the size of his thumb. He looked across the fence to Jed's field. Jed was out there planting beans with his old International 806 and a 6-row planter he'd bought for scrap and rebuilt. The rig was slow, it was noisy, and it had no air conditioning, but it was running. Jed had his own breakdown that week. A steel hydraulic line on the versatile, weakened by 20 years of vibration, developed a pinhole leak. He saw the telltale shimmer of fluid on the frame, shut the engine down, and walked back to his shop. He didn't have a new line, but he did have his torch. He carefully cut out the weak section of the steel tube. From a coffee can full of old fittings, he found two that matched. He brazed them onto the good ends of the line, then cut a new piece of high-pressure rubber hose to bridge the gap, securing it with two heavy-duty clamps. The repair took him 45 minutes and cost him nothing but a little gas and brass. By noon, he was back in the field, the old Cummins roaring its defiant song against the silent, waiting fields of his neighbors. The first foreclosure auction was that fall. It was a small farmer east of town. The crowd was quiet, their faces grim. These weren't collectors or hobbyists looking for a bargain. They were neighbors watching a man's life be dismantled piece by piece. Lyle Peterson was there, standing by the banker, his face like stone. He was there to protect his investment, to bid on the John Deere equipment he had sold the man just 2 years prior, to ensure it didn't sell for pennies on the dollar. He wasn't a prophet of prosperity anymore, he was an undertaker. The whispers in the community changed. The pity once reserved for Jed Stone was now directed at the men with the shiny new sheds full of green paint. The men who had laughed at Jed's old V-Ripper were now lying awake at night, the cold arithmetic of their variable rate loans echoing in the dark. The wind had started to blow and the house of cards was beginning to tremble. The hammer fell in the winter of 1981. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, determined to slay the dragon of inflation, cranked interest rates to levels not seen since the Civil War. The prime rate, the number upon which all their farm loans were based, surged past 20%. It was a death sentence delivered by mail. Operating loans that had carried an interest rate of 8% when they were signed now demanded 21%. A farmer who had borrowed $100,000 for spring inputs suddenly owed an extra $13,000 in interest alone. It was impossible, the numbers simply did not compute. The wave of auctions became a tsunami. Every Saturday, the local paper was filled with sale bills, stark black and white listings of land, tractors, combines, and households. They were obituaries for family farms. Jed went to Tom Henderson's auction. He stood at the back of the crowd, his heart a cold, heavy lump in his chest. He watched as the 4840, the one Tom had been so proud of, was sold. He watched as they sold the family's second car, the furniture from the living room, the swing set from the backyard. Tom's wife stood on the porch of the house they were about to lose, her face a blank mask of shock. Tom was nowhere to be seen. Lyle Peterson's empire was collapsing in on itself. His lot was now filled with repossessed equipment, most of it worth less than what was owed on it. He couldn't sell it, no one had the money or the credit. He was paying 20% interest on millions of dollars of inventory that was gathering dust. John Deere Corporate sent a team of men in suits from Moline. They walked through the dealership with clipboards, not speaking to anyone. A week later, the Peterson Implement sign came down. The bank, which held the mortgage on the building, locked the doors. Lyle's personal finances were no better. The record-priced farm he had bought next to Jed was a millstone around his neck. He had borrowed heavily to purchase it, confident that land values would continue to climb. Instead, they had crashed. The land was now worth less than half of what he owed. The bank called his note. The auction for Lyle's farm was on a cold, blustery day in November. The crowd was smaller this time, the morbid curiosity of the earlier sales replaced by a weary sadness. Jed was there. He saw Lyle standing alone by a fence post, staring at the ground. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a simple work coat and worn jeans. The Lincoln Continental was gone, replaced by an old beat-up Ford pickup. He looked smaller, older. The swaggering confidence that had defined him was utterly extinguished. When the auctioneer started the bidding on the first parcel of land, the very ground Lyle had paid $5,000 an acre for, the opening bid was $1,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Lyle didn't even look up. He had lost it all. The dealership, the farm, the big new house on the hill. The future he had been selling was a fiction, and he had been its most devoted believer. Jed didn't bid. He wasn't a vulture. He had no interest in profiting from another man's ruin. He watched as the land sold for a fraction of its former value to an out-of-state insurance company. When the sale was over, the crowd dispersed quickly, eager to escape the ghost of their own recent prosperity. Jed saw Lyle walking toward his old truck, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Their eyes met for a moment across the harvested cornfield. There was no animosity in Lyle's gaze, only a profound, hollow emptiness. Jed gave a slow, deliberate nod, a simple acknowledgement of a shared, painful history. Lyle hesitated, then gave a slight nod back, before getting in his truck and driving away, leaving a cloud of dust to hang in the cold, still air. While his neighbors' worlds were coming apart, Jed's remained stubbornly intact. His days were governed by the familiar rhythms of the seasons, not the terrifying calculus of the prime rate. With corn prices in the basement, he kept most of his 1982 crop in his bin, the one he had paid for with cash. He could afford to wait. His operating costs were so low he could break even on corn prices that were bankrupting other farmers. He fixed his own machinery, welded his own gates, and lived within the means the land provided. His savings certificates, which had seemed so foolishly conservative during the boom, were now earning high interest, a small but steady income stream in a sea of red ink. He was a ship with a shallow draft, riding out a storm that was sinking the heavy, debt-laden vessels all around him. He had survived. A few months after the auction, Jed hired a man to help him with spring tillage. It was Tom Henderson. Tom had lost his farm, his equipment, everything. He was renting a small house in town and working odd jobs to feed his family. He showed up at Jed's farm one morning, his hat in his hands, his pride scraped raw, but his need greater. "Jed," he said, his voice quiet, "I'll do anything. Fix fence, scoop manure, whatever you got. I just need the work." Jed nodded. "I could use a hand getting the dissing done. Pay you cash at the end of every day." They worked together for 2 weeks, sharing a thermos of coffee in the mornings and a quiet lunch in the cab of the Versatile. One afternoon, they were in the shop, getting the old V-Ripper ready for fall. Jed was replacing one of the points, and Tom was greasing the coulters. Tom stopped, running his hand along the massive straight shank of the Ripper. "I remember this," he said softly. "The Miller auction. I was there. I was one of the guys laughing when you bought it." Jed stopped tightening a bolt and looked at him. Tom wouldn't meet his gaze. He stared at the piece of steel in his hands. "We all thought you were crazy, Jed. A damn fool. Stuck in the past. We were all signing papers for new 4-wheel drives, talking about farming fence row to fence row, and you were dragging this piece of junk home to straighten it with a sledgehammer." He finally looked up, and Jed saw the sheen of tears in his eyes. "We were the fools. We weren't buying tractors. We were buying payments. We weren't investing in the future. We were betting on it. And the house had all the cards." He shook his head slowly. "You looked at this thing and you saw good steel. All we saw was rust." It was the only apology Jed would ever need. It wasn't an "I'm sorry," but an "I understand." In that moment, in the quiet of his workshop, surrounded by the tools and the machines he knew so well, Jed felt a vindication more profound than any financial success. He hadn't just been right about money, he had been right about value. A year later, Jed heard that Lyle Peterson was working as a mechanic at a small independent garage in a town 2 counties over. On a Saturday when he needed to pick up a part nearby, Jed made a detour. He found the garage, a greasy 2-bay cinder-block building. Lyle was underneath a pickup truck, a ratchet clicking rhythmically. Jed waited. When Lyle slid out on a creeper, he was covered in grease. He looked up and his face went blank with surprise. "Jed," he said, wiping his hands on an already filthy rag. "Lyle," Jed replied, "heard you were turning wrenches again." "A man's gotta eat," Lyle said, a trace of his old defiance in his voice. "That old Cummins in my Versatile is getting tired," Jed said, getting straight to the point. "She's due for an in-frame overhaul, new sleeves, pistons, bearings. It's a bigger job than I want to tackle alone. I was wondering if you'd be interested in giving me a hand with it. I'll pay you your shop rate in cash." Lyle stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. He was expecting scorn, pity, or gloating. He was not expecting a job offer. He was not expecting respect. "Why?" he finally managed to ask. "Because you might have been a hell of a salesman, Lyle," Jed said, his voice even. "But before all that, You were one of the best diesel mechanics in this state, and I need a good mechanic, not a salesman." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of a cooling engine block nearby. Lyle looked down at his grease-stained hands, then back at Jed. The hardness in his eyes finally dissolved. "When do you want to start?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion Jed couldn't quite name. As the decade wore on, the farm economy slowly began to heal. The landscape was scarred, dotted with empty farmsteads and fields owned by distant corporations. But the survivors began to pick up the pieces. Jed's farm became an unlikely center of this new, chastened reality. Farmers who had once sped past his place on their way to the dealership now stopped by his shop. They came with broken parts they couldn't afford to replace, asking if he knew a way to weld them, to patch them, to keep the old iron running for one more season. Jed never turned anyone away. His knowledge, once seen as obsolete, was now a precious resource. He was no longer the county eccentric. He was the keeper of an older, more durable wisdom. In 1988, the bank called him. The 80 acres that had once belonged to Tom Henderson, which bordered Jed's land to the north, had been repossessed from the insurance company that bought it. They offered it to Jed for a fair cash price. He bought it. He wasn't getting big. He was just making his own piece of the world whole again. Years passed. The paint on the versatile 145 faded even more, from a dull red to a pale, sun-bleached pink. But the Cummins V8, rebuilt with Lyle Peterson's help all those years ago, still fired on the first turn of the key, its deep-throated rumble a constant, reassuring presence. One warm summer afternoon, Jed was in the shop, his hands, now gnarled with arthritis, guiding the smaller hands of his 12-year-old grandson, Ben. They were replacing a wheel bearing on the old V-Ripper. "Grandpa," Ben asked, his face smudged with grease, "why do we still use this old stuff?" "Dad said Mr. Thompson next door has a new tractor that steers itself with a satellite." Jed stopped and looked at his grandson. He pointed to the tractor. "You see that versatile? I bought it used in '69, paid cash. You see this Ripper? I paid $20 for it at an auction when your dad was just a boy." Everyone laughed. He picked up a heavy wrench and placed it in Ben's hand, closing the boy's fingers around it. "Ben, there are two kinds of things in this world. Things you own and things that own you. This land, this tractor, this tool in your hand, we own them. They don't send us a bill every month. They ask for sweat and for respect, and in return, they give us a living. That fancy new tractor that steers itself. It owns the man driving it. It owns him with the bank payment, with the computer parts you can't fix, with the idea that you always need the newest, biggest thing to get ahead." He looked out the wide door of the machine shed across the fields of dark green soybeans shimmering in the heat. "This land will test you," he said, his voice a low rumble like the engine of the old tractor. "It'll send you drought and flood, good prices and bad. The only way to stand firm on it is to have your feet planted on something solid, and there's nothing more solid than good steel that's been paid for." Ben looked from the old, scarred Ripper to the ancient, mighty tractor, and then up at his grandfather's weathered face. He was just a boy, but in that quiet moment, surrounded by the smell of grease and earth, he understood. He gripped the wrench a little tighter and turned back to the job at hand, ready to learn. Jed watched him, a slow smile touching his lips. The harvest was safe. The legacy was secure.